Hello class, this video is about the third standard under evolution, and my phrase for it is evolution is backed up by a whole lot of proof. So in this particular standard you need to know why it's been proven that evolution exists. As we talked about previously, you know, in the beginning there was a lot of people that were hating on evolution, that didn't believe in evolution. Even to this day there's still people believe in evolution. But you need to know the 4 reasons why scientists can back up or support the belief that evolution really does exist. So just to sort of review, like since it's been a while since we did this lecture, remember the term natural selection coined by Darwin. 5 probably key points. 1, evolution is a change in species over time, not just, you know, over a generation, but over millions of years. Step 2, or part 2 that you need to know, is that there's an overproduction of offspring, which means there's competition. Because there's competition, that's why species have to evolve. Number 3, heritable variations exist within the population. That means as you have offspring, they differ slightly. When you have kids, when your parents had kids, like you don't look exactly like the parents. There's a slight variation, and that variation is important for evolution. Number 4, these variations can result in differential reproductive success. So these variations at times can cause a benefit during competition. And lastly, over generations, this can result in changes in the genetic composition of the population. So remember that individuals don't evolve, it's populations that evolve. So the direct evidence, the 4 things you need to know for the standard, or what's the evidence? Direct observations, fossil record, homology, and biogeography. And all 4 I'm going to explain for you. So here's a nice chart if you wanted to like fill this in or help study. Number 1, direct observations. This is our first evidence. It's the easiest ones because direct observations mean to actually see it. So, for example, in our experience, I don't know if you guys heard of DDT before, but it's this pesticide that kills insects. And after a couple of generations of insects, insects, for humans it takes like 20-30 years before we hit a next generation. But for insects, within days you have a new generation. So within months or years, after a while, all of a sudden these insects and pests don't die to pesticides anymore. That's proof that there has to be evolution, or else why would some pests not die from pesticides? That exact same thing is true with bacteria called MRSA. You may have heard of this. They call it the superbug. But there's been people recently that suffer under MRSA, and it's evolved, and there's no real cure for it because every time we find a cure, it just evolves, and it's an uncurable disease. Number 2 is fossil record. It's very easy. Fossils, they're traces of the past, or traces of organisms from the past. So very simply, they just look at fossils and they notice that fossils of a species, after a while, they don't look the same anymore. They find it in sedimentary rock. You guys know paleontology is the study of fossils. And looking at this picture, they notice that between a dog, this is the dog's a backbone, and they notice that in a pig, in this previous one, in a deer, like after a while, they look almost exactly the same, even though they're totally different species. That proves there has to be some sort of change over time. So, sort of like the, I guess, evolution you can think of, there's prokaryotes, then there was eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, the oldest fossils, remember those that don't have a nucleus, and eukaryotes do have a nucleus. So they're saying in the transition of evolution, we went from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds and then to mammals. And then they've even found fossils of something called transitional forms, which means like there's a half fish, half reptile. There's a half reptile, half bird. There's like a half bird, half mammal. Like there's all these transitional forms. There's these fossils of animals that don't exist, but they're like a link to modern species. The third one is homology. Homology, the prefix homo, you may have heard, means like the same. So there are characteristics in related species. They have an underlying similarity, even though their functions differ. So homologous structures, for example, think of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. They all have the same sort of like an arm bone, like whether a human, cat, whale, bat. And the question is, they have a homologous structure, meaning that if we all have the same forelimb, right, we have to have some sort of common ancestry. Embryonic homologies, that means similar early development. So embryos from different types of species, or even different types of species, they end up being like sort of the same. The embryos are kind of the same. So during the process, when species grow, they realize that they actually have the exact same, like the beginning is actually pretty similar. Vestigial organs, meaning they're organs that we once had but now we don't have. Structures with little or no use. So some people like to say, for us, like the appendix, or that we actually have a tailbone, and people are saying like, oh, maybe we used to have a tail once, or we evolved and don't have a tail anymore. Another vestigial organ that's very easy to remember is like, think about birds that don't fly, like a chicken or a dodo. It's like, why do they have wings? Like, you know, like they're flightless bird wings, so maybe they evolved from a previous version and all of a sudden they don't need to fly anymore. And then there's molecular homologies that's saying like the DNA structures between two different species are very similar. So let me show you pictures of each of them. The homologous structure, remember I told you about the human, cat, whale, and bat? So they all have the same structure. They all have a humerus, they all have a radius, they all have an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and even phalanges. So all four of these, even though they're totally different species, they all have the same basic structures of a limb. When we talk about embryonic development, here's a chick embryo and here's a human embryo. I told you at the beginning they're actually very similar. So these pharyngeal pouches, almost exactly the same, and a post-anal tail, both the same for a chicken and a human, even though, you know, we're not related at all. Vestigial structures, we're talking about parts that don't that animals have that aren't necessary. So here's a picture of a whale, and here's like a bone if you dissect the whale, and they notice that, there's a bone here that doesn't do anything. Like, why would an animal have a bone that doesn't do anything? Same thing with flightless birds as well. Molecular homologies, we're talking about DNA. So we're going to talk about DNA and amino acids a little bit ways from now, but we're talking about, if you remember in biology a chain of DNA, funny thing is that chain of DNA, millions and millions of chain lengths long, even though there's, you know, a bajillion possibilities, there actually is across many different organisms like very same structure or sequences. If you know DNA, there was A, T, G, and C. I don't know if you guys remember that, but in a chain length they found, like, you know, humans and monkeys and chickens and frogs, they have like a monkey only differs, of the million chain long DNA, only differs in eight pieces. A lamprey, only 100, we don't even look like a lamprey, only 125 letters are different in a million long sequence. So here's an example of what they've sort of come up with, an evolutionary tree, meaning, you know, there was like at some point some competition, so it branched off, or the competition made like lungfishes and then into like another thing. Same thing with amphibians, and then, you know, this is how essentially the tree of evolution is looks like. Convergent evolution, this distantly related species, they can resemble one another. Oops, sorry. Similar problem means similar solution. So analogous structures mean similar structures function in similar environments. So think about it this way. A shark, a penguin, and a dolphin, they have the same like torpedo shape. Like if you visualize a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin, like they have the same torpedo shape. It's like, why would they have a similar body type? They're not even in the same, you know, they're not even in the same location. That's called convergent evolution. Like things evolve very similarly, even though they're not related, but just they have the same problems. Same thing with flying squirrels and sugar gliders in Australia. Completely different, completely far away, but because of similar, you know, competition for food, they've constructed themselves, their bodies have changed in a certain way. And the last evidence for evolution is called biogeography, just like it sounds, bio meaning living and geography meaning like a location. So the geographic distribution of species. Species in nearby geographic areas resemble each other. Continental drift and Pangea, you may have heard of that, but, you know, when the world first started, we were just one gigantic landmass, and then we've all separated into the continents. One vocab word you need to know, endemic species. They're found at a certain geographic location and nowhere else. That's called endemic. So the marine iguanas in the Galapagos, that's the only place you'll find a marine iguana. Everywhere else is just a land iguana. There's no such thing as a marine iguana. So you're saying, like, what do you mean by biogeography? If you look at this next slide, for example, if I have an island with species A, and if I separate, or if they, you know, broke off into another island, they notice that those on a different island originally look like A, now turn into B. If that island or these species B broke off into another island and became a third island, they notice that it evolved into C also. And the same thing with, you know, a new D, a new E. They notice that biogeographically, even though later on and down the line I see islands, like think of this as Hawaii, like every island has a very similar species. The case in point is the Galapagos tortoises. So the tortoises in the Galapagos, which is in the slide I showed you before, they're all in different islands, but even though depending on which island they're at,
their shells are completely different, and that's how they could tell like which island the tortoise came from. So that's it for this standard. You need to know four pieces of evidence in which evolution is proven. All right, thank you. Take care.